The story I want to share with you today is about an evil that manifests at a young age. This particular case has been studied extensively over the years, and it raises important questions about the nature versus nurture debate, what shapes us as children and makes us who we are, and how we as humans can overcome even the worst childhood traumas. However, in some instances, the worst circumstances don't just come from external factors. They come from within and lead to murder. This is the story of Ed Kemper. On August 27, 1964, the police in North Fork, California, a quiet rural area in the Sierra Mountains, received a disturbing phone call. On the other end of the line was a 15-year-old boy named Edmund Kemper III, who confessed to an unthinkable crime. He had just murdered his own grandparents. In a place like North Fork where nothing much happens, the idea of a teenage boy killing his grandparents in cold blood seemed inconceivable. Yet when the police arrived at the Kemper farm, there was Edmund, whom everyone called Ed, calmly waiting to be arrested and taken to jail. When the police asked Ed why he committed the murders, he said that he was angry at the world. But he didn't stop there. He also admitted that he wanted to know what it felt like to take a life. The officers were shocked by how calmly Ed described his actions, as if committing a double homicide was just another part of his day. Since Ed had already confessed, he continued to share the entire horrific story. According to Ed, it all started after an argument with his grandmother Maud, while his grandfather, also named Ed, was out running errands. Ed and Maud had a tense relationship, and the fight escalated when she tried to take away his gun, which had been a Christmas gift from his grandfather. Instead of handing over the gun, Ed shot Maud in the head right there in the farmhouse kitchen. He then fired a few more shots into her chest to ensure she was dead. Ed told the police that he killed his grandfather so that he wouldn't have to find out about his wife's death. With Maud's body still in the kitchen, Ed waited outside with his rifle for his grandfather to return home. As soon as his grandfather arrived, Ed took aim and fired, completing the gruesome act he had started inside. Even the most experienced officers were shaken by the brutal murders. At just 15 years old, Ed was already nearly 6 feet 4 inches tall, intelligent, and disturbingly calm as he explained his rationale for committing such a terrible crime. The police arrested him immediately, and since Ed was a minor, he fell under the jurisdiction of the California Youth Authority. However, the Youth Authority was so appalled by the murders that they realized this kid and his crimes were far beyond their scope. It was simply unfathomable to the justice system at the time that a child could commit such heinous acts. As a result, they turned Ed over to the adult branch of California's legal system. According to the Billings Gazette, back in September 1964, the first thing the court did was sentence Ed to an indefinite term. He underwent a psychiatric evaluation and was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. However, the judge, like everyone else, considered these murders to be beyond comprehension. Instead of sending Ed to a typical juvenile facility, and certainly not to an adult facility, he was sentenced to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security mental institution for the criminally insane. After Ed was locked up at Atascadero, doctors, psychologists, and law enforcement remained fascinated by him. He stood out literally because, as I mentioned earlier, he was a big guy and still growing. But he also stood out because he was exceptionally well-behaved and intelligent, like really, really smart. Doctors administered various assessments and IQ tests to Ed, and he registered at near genius levels. According to former FBI agent John Douglas in his book Mindhunter, Ed became so familiar with the tests that the hospital authorities allowed him to review them and even administer them to other inmates. Can you believe it? This disturbed teenage boy was literally giving psychological assessments to adult male sex offenders. It's just so out of line, in my opinion. Now, ED's behavior while incarcerated led some of his doctors to question the paranoid schizophrenia diagnosis. They continued to study and reevaluate him, and Ed, being so bright, figured out exactly what they wanted to hear. Remember how we discussed this in our Rodney Alcala episode? How he learned to appear sane and rehabilitated in front of the parole board so that he could go free? Well, that's pretty much what Ed did. To me, this is a significant sign of how dangerous he really is. Not only did he gain access to these evaluations, but he also used the information within them to get his diagnosis reduced to a personality disorder with passive aggression. He's totally gaming the system, right? And passive aggressive? He murdered 2 people in his own family. There's nothing passive about that. You'd think so, wouldn't you? I mean, he actively killed 2 people. But the penal system in California at the time was more focused on rehabilitation than punishment for one's actions. With Ed being so young and such a model prisoner, they viewed him almost as a success story, believing that their rehabilitation strategy was working. By the time Ed turned 21 in 1969, his doctors were so impressed with the progress he had made while incarcerated that he was released from the mental institution on parole in December of that same year. Despite his doctors advising against it, Ed went to live with his mom, Clark Nell, in Aptos on the Pacific Coast in Central California, about 180 miles away from where he had murdered his grandparents in North Fork. On the outside, everything seemed to be going great. Maybe he really was rehabilitated. The nearby city of Santa Cruz was a university town with plenty of educational opportunities, and ED's mom worked at UC Santa Cruz. She gave Ed a parking pass, so he was on campus a lot and saw plenty of co-eds out hitchhiking. Keep in mind, Ed was still on parole and under law enforcement supervision, but as far as they could tell, he was taking it seriously and behaving himself. According to an article on Biography.com, he started attending community college. When that didn't work out, he actually applied to be a state trooper. Ultimately, Ed was turned down, not because of his criminal record, which they didn't even know about, but because of his sheer size. Apparently, being so big was a no-go, which I didn't realize was a thing. By the time he was done growing, Ed was a whopping 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighed about 300 pounds. He was a giant dude, and his size was outside the state's physical requirements. Truthfully, I don't even know if they got far enough to look into his criminal record, or if they just took one look at him and thought, yeah, we don't have a uniform that fits. You're too big, buddy. But either way, Ed didn't take it personally. In fact, the local law enforcement in Santa Cruz actually became pretty fond of him. They all ended up hanging out after work at the same bar, a little place called the Jury Room. To the cops, he was just Big Ed, their friend, the gentle giant. After being turned down by the California State Troopers, Ed got a steady job working for the California Department of Transportation doing road construction. It was good, solid work with a steady paycheck, further vindicating the parole board's belief that Ed was making great progress and had become a valuable member of society. They were so confident in him that his record was actually expunged in the fall of 1972. There was even a letter of recommendation from his psychiatrist, which I think is pretty incredible. Let me read it to you. If I were to see this patient without having any history available or getting any history from him, I would think that we were dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who had initiative, intelligence, and who was free of any psychiatric illnesses. It is my opinion that he has made a very excellent response to the years of treatment and rehabilitation, and I would see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be of any danger to himself or to any member of society. As you can see, everyone from police to mental health professionals was 150% confident that Ed was cured and ready to live a happy and productive life. Meanwhile, though, the city of Santa Cruz, near where Ed was living, was suddenly rocked by unthinkable tragedies. Starting in the fall of 1972, the Santa Cruz police suddenly saw a series of shocking murders and disappearances transform their sleepy beach town into a hotbed of horror. According to the police, it all started in August when a skull was discovered in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Dental records identified the remains as belonging to Mary Ann, a 19-year-old college student who had gone missing from nearby Berkeley along with her friend Anita. With only Mary Ann's skull found and no trace of Anita, the police were forced to assume the worst about what had happened to these two young women. The nightmare continued in mid-September when a teenage girl named Aiko vanished from Berkeley. The Oakland Tribune reported that she disappeared while waiting for her bus to San Francisco for a ballet class. With Anita and Aiko missing and Mary Ann confirmed dead, Santa Cruz concern turned into a full-blown nightmare by mid-October. The situation escalated on Friday the 13th when a homeless man named Lawrence White was found beaten to death with a baseball bat. That same month, a young woman named Mary was declared missing after failing to show up for a job interview. In early November, a priest was beaten and stabbed to death in his own confessional booth. The public and the police were beyond shaken by these events, particularly because in the early 1970s in the United States, statistics showed that 95% of murders were not premeditated. Most happened as a result of fights or domestic incidents gone horribly wrong. The type of murders happening in Santa Cruz were simply incomprehensible to the local police, who had never seen anything like it before. They issued warnings to the public, urging them to be careful, use common sense around strangers, and avoid hitchhiking. However, fear within the community continued to mount. Before this string of crimes, Santa Cruz had been a relaxed place, the type of town where people moved to escape the big city hustle and enjoy life by the ocean. Now suddenly the whole town was terrified that they might have a serial killer on their hands. The Santa Cruz state troopers shared their fears with their big friend Ed at the local bar, lamenting that they had no leads beyond a witness from the church and no way of stopping whoever was responsible. As 1972 turned into 1973, the police were unaware that the worst was yet to come. In January, another woman went missing and reappeared in a terrifying fashion when parts of her dismembered body washed up on the shores. The Santa Cruz Sentinel identified her as Cynthia Cindy Shaw, a 19-year-old local college student like Marianne and Anita. As if all of this wasn't bad enough, on January 25th, literally the day after Cindy's head was identified, the killer terrorizing Santa Cruz claimed 5 lives in a single day, fatally shooting and stabbing 2 families and their young children. And the killer wasn't done yet. As the narrator continues, they reveal that 2 more UC Santa Cruz students, Allison and Rosalind, went missing on February 5th. The very next day, 4 teenage boys were shot dead at an illegal campsite in a state park just north of Santa Cruz. That's 2 murder sprees, and 2 more missing college students in just 12 days. The narrator questions whether anyone was connecting these 2 sprees at the time, noting that the modus operandi MO seemed quite different. However, they acknowledge that law enforcement in the 1970s may not have been using MO and crime pattern analysis to the same extent as they do today. The narrator couldn't find definitive information about whether the police believed it was one person or multiple people responsible for the crimes. What was clear, though, was the variety of victims in terms of age, gender, and the manner in which they were killed. As mentioned before, this was a completely different type of murder than anything the Santa Cruz police had ever encountered. The narrator emphasizes that all of these events were happening simultaneously, with bodies turning up left and right, some of them in pieces. It was a lot for anyone to handle. Regardless of whether the police thought it was one person or multiple people responsible, they knew that something had changed in their town and it had to be stopped. Before they could put an end to the violence, another set of remains was found on February 12th. This time, the victim had been stabbed and dissected. The following day, the police received yet another call about a murder after an old man weeding his lawn was shot in broad daylight. Unlike the other murders, this time they were able to catch the killer, a man named Herbert Mullen, in a strange parallel to ED's behavior back in 1964 after killing his grandparents. Herb was very calm when he was arrested, not resisting and willingly going with the police. With Herb in custody, the police were desperately trying to tie him to all of the missing and murdered people in the area. However, according to Katie Dowd's article on SF Gate's website, the police and the DA couldn't find definitive evidence linking him to all of the crimes. When they couldn't make the connections they wanted, the DA tried to deflect responsibility onto non-local killers using Santa Cruz as a dumping ground. The narrator interprets this as the authorities believing there was more than one killer, but not necessarily wanting to acknowledge more than one local person being responsible. They suggest that the police wanted it to be Herb and only Herb, but the evidence didn't support that conclusion. The narrator suggests that even if the police wanted to pin all the crimes on Herb Mullen, they likely couldn't because they noticed something interesting about the techniques used in some of the cases. It seemed that where there was dismemberment or dissection, there were 2 very distinct and different ways the bodies had been mutilated. Some of the cases were neater, as if the killer had a clear idea of what they were doing, while others were sloppier, messier, and less planned out. It almost seemed like one killer was just hacking around, while in other cases the killer appeared to have a specific plan in mind. Even after Herb's arrest, more bodies turned up, and these bodies exhibited that very neat and clean style of dissection and dismemberment. This happened in early March, when hikers in San Mateo County, just north of Santa Cruz, stumbled upon a skull and a jawbone. When law enforcement arrived on the scene, they noticed that the jawbone didn't match the skull, but they were able to locate a matching skull nearby during their search. The remains were taken back for identification, and dental records proved once again that a killer was still preying on Santa Cruz college students. The results came back as Allison and Rosalind, the 2 girls who had gone missing back in February. The narrator acknowledges that since Allison and Rosalind went missing before Herb was arrested, it could have still been him. However, they believe there's a clear distinction between Herb's killings and this other person's murders. For clarification, the ones attributed to Herb were the messier, less organized decapitations and dissections. The narrator isn't surprised that bodies and bones continue to be found, but they think there was a belief or naive hope that making an arrest would mean an end to the discoveries, and everyone could move on. However, that's not what happened, and the media in Santa Cruz pressured the DA about this, asking why people were still turning up dead if they had the guy in custody. The DA's response is illuminating as he states, "We then have another homicidal maniac on our hands." On February 17th, Herb is charged with 10 counts of murder for the 9 people slaughtered during the 2 sprees on January 25th and February 6th, and for the man who was weeding his lawn on February 12th. As the narrator continues the chilling tale, they reveal that even with Herb Mullen off the streets, the police and the DA were at a complete loss. The city was on edge, and no one felt safe. Worst of all, they had no idea how to stop this second killer. Just before Easter, the Santa Cruz police received a strange phone call that changed everything they thought they knew about the investigation. On April 23, 1973, the police were shocked beyond belief when they received a call from Ed Kemper, their buddy Big Ed. Ed told them an extraordinarily disturbing story. He confessed to killing his own mother, with whom he had been living since his release from the hospital in 1969. He described how he had waited for his mom to fall asleep before sneaking into her bedroom and bludgeoning her to death with a claw hammer. As if that wasn't brutal enough, Ed revealed that he had cut out her tongue and larynx, putting them in the garbage disposal before severing her head and using it for dart practice. He also admitted to engaging in sexual activity with his mother's decapitated head. As if this wasn't already beyond comprehension, Ed went on to tell the police that he had also murdered his mother's best friend Sally and cut her head off too. He informed them that they would find Sally's body in the closet at his mother's apartment. However, Ed told the police that they couldn't come and arrest him in Santa Cruz because he was actually in Pueblo, Colorado, where he had fled after killing his mother and her friend. According to the Santa Cruz Sentinel, Ed urged the police to come and get him before he went on a killing spree and took even more lives. At first, the police thought it was just a prank call, albeit not a very funny one. They knew Ed and considered him a nice guy and totally harmless. They hung up and brushed it off. It took Ed calling back and asking to speak to a specific cop, someone he knew well and thought would take him seriously, for them to finally realize he wasn't kidding. Ed had to provide details about the crime that only the killer would know, and little by little it started to sink in for the police that this was no joke. It was real. They knew they had one chance to stop a killer, and even Ed himself seemed to understand that he needed to be stopped. As reported by the Colorado Springs Gazette-Telegraph, Ed said he just got to worrying about the murders, indicating that they were weighing on him, and he knew he would never be able to stop on his own. At some point it was bound to catch up with him. Despite reeling from ED's confession and the heinous acts he described, the police kept him talking on the phone while they traced the call and contacted law enforcement in Colorado, where Ed was located. The narrator continues the story, detailing how the police worked quickly to locate the phone booth Ed was calling from, and the Pueblo police made an arrest. Meanwhile, the police in Santa Cruz hurried to the duplex where Ed had been living with his mother. Just as he had said, they found his mother's mutilated body and Sally's corpse stuffed in the closet. However, the shocking revelations didn't end there. Once in police custody, Ed claimed to be the co-ed killer who had been terrorizing Santa Cruz for months, responsible for killing the hitchhiking students. The Santa Cruz DA and other law enforcement officers rushed to Colorado to bring Ed back to California to face the consequences of his crimes. Surprisingly, Ed was not only willing to talk but seemed almost eager to do so. It was as if telling the truth and unburdening himself from all the phenolics was a relief. The narrator notes that ED's demeanor during this confession was just as cool and collected as when he had admitted to killing his grandparents years earlier. While there may have been a hint of being frazzled, possibly due to the realization that his actions would catch up with him and that he would never be able to stop, ED's overall attitude was one of unburdening himself, finally able to tell someone what he had really been doing and who he really was. According to biography.com, Ed told the police that he had been planning his actions for years, essentially from the moment he was released from the mental hospital. He had bought a car and created his own kill kit containing items like handcuffs and plastic bags. However, his urges were not yet out of control and he remained very organized, weighing his options. Ed estimated that he had picked up around 150 female hitchhikers in Santa Cruz and the nearby counties between 1970 and 1972, letting them all go before finally abducting Marianne and Anita and beginning his killing spree. The narrator wonders if Ed had been practicing during this time, learning how to act to keep his victims calm and studying their behavior to see what startled them. He was essentially studying his prey and learning, just as he had done in prison when figuring out how to act. When Ed began his killing spree with Marianne, He took the victims back to his mother's house, dismembered them, and engaged in sexual activity with their bodies before disposing of pieces of them in the Santa Cruz mountains. Although Mary Ann's skull was found, no trace of Anita's body has ever been discovered despite intense searches. Edie's crimes against Anita and Mary Ann set the pattern for his future murders and revealed his proclivities. As he told the police, between May 1972 and April 1973, he killed 8 women in total. Ed confessed to being responsible for the disappearances of some of the hitchhiking co-eds who went missing, while Herbert Mullen was also committing his killings in the area. Ed revealed that he would use his official campus parking pass, obtained through his mother's employment at UC Santa Cruz, to lure his victims into a false sense of security. He would act as if he too was a student, making his victims feel comfortable and at ease. Once they were in his car, Ed would engage them in conversation, learning their names and maintaining a friendly demeanor, seeming like a perfectly normal guy until it was too late. Just as he had done with his mother, Sally, Anita, and Mary Ann, Ed provided highly detailed accounts of how he killed Aiko, Cindy, Rosalind, and Allison. He even told investigators where parts of their bodies could still be found. Although portions of Cindy's body had washed up on shore, the police only discovered her head when Ed led them to where it was buried in his mother's backyard. With each passing story, it became increasingly clear to law enforcement just how wrong they had been about their big buddy Ed. The narrator chooses not to delve into the graphic details of the killings, as Ed was one of the most disturbed murderers, engaging in extensive dismemberment and necrophilia. These horrible acts usually indicate an escalation in deviant behavior, but with Ed it seemed to have been present from the very beginning. Behind the facade of a gentle giant lurked a monster capable of acts that defied imagination. Shockingly, Ed had never been on the police's radar as a possible person of interest. The realization that they had been so thoroughly fooled was jarring for the seasoned cops. In hindsight, they understood that Ed hadn't been listening to their conversations at the bar to be polite. He had been gathering information to learn their techniques and stay one step ahead of them. It was a hard lesson that you never truly know anyone. As the police continued their investigation into the murders and the DA prepared the case over the summer of 1973, Herbert Mullen's trial began. Surprisingly, the trial started with the revelation that Mullen had killed Mary and decapitated her, a crime for which he wasn't being tried. Mullen's lawyer's opening statement casually dropped this fact, along with the admission that Mullen had also killed Lawrence White and beaten a priest to death back in 1972. The way this information was presented was almost nonchalant, as if the lawyer was saying, "No big deal, just increasing my client's body count to 13 instead of the crimes you've already charged him with." Simultaneously, as Mullen's trial proceeded, Santa Cruz detectives began digging into ED's background to uncover the truth about him, seeking to understand his motives and the factors that drove him to commit such atrocities. They knew they had to go back to the beginning and learn everything there was to know about Ed Kemper. ED's willingness to discuss his crimes didn't diminish, and he began giving interviews from prison even before his trial started. Through these interviews and numerous interrogations, the police were able to delve deeper into ED's background in the months leading up to his trial. As the investigation into Ed Kemper's background continues, the police uncover that he had been different from the moment he was born. Weighing a staggering 13 pounds as a newborn, ED's size shocked both his father, Ed Kemper II, and his mother, Clarnell, as neither of them expected to have a son of such proportions, despite their own tall stature. The differences between Ed and other children only grew more pronounced as he aged, and there was no denying the fact that Ed was a peculiar child, something he himself admitted while in custody. His mother was both highly domineering and prone to belittling her son, described by ED's half-brother David as a complete alcoholic psycho. Although Ed had a good relationship with his father, his relationship with his mother became increasingly toxic. Katie Dowd of SF Gate reported that by the time Ed turned 8, his mother was convinced that he would molest his sisters, leading her to isolate him in the basement, away from the rest of the family. The narrator acknowledges that this was a different era, with vastly different attitudes towards mental health and child psychology compared to today. While not claiming to be an expert, the narrator has undergone extensive trauma-informed training in foster parenting and recognizes that isolation is one of the most psychologically damaging things one can do to a child. The narrator questions whether anyone attempted to get Ed help, such as taking him to a therapist, but finds no evidence of such efforts. Despite, or perhaps because of this treatment, ED's behavior continued to become more bizarre as he grew older, particularly after his parents' divorce. His mother moved Ed and his sisters to Montana, hundreds of miles away from their father in California. Although Edie's relationship with his mother had always been poor, the divorce and the distance from his father only made it worse, and his violent tendencies began to manifest in earnest. By the age of 10, Ed was torturing and killing family pets, a well-known red flag for antisocial behavior. He told authorities about his disturbing make-believe games with his sisters, which instead of involving normal childhood fantasies like castles or dinosaurs, revolved around the electric chair and gas chamber, with Ed pretending to die in horrific ways. He would also mutilate his sister's dolls and talk about killing his teachers. While Edie's cruelty to animals persisted, he had not harmed either of his sisters by the time he ran away at age 13, heading back to California to be with his father. However, instead of being overjoyed to see his son, Ed's father had already remarried and started a new family, leaving no place for Ed. He sent Ed to live with his own parents, Ed and Maud, on their farm in North Fork, California. The prevailing assumption at the time was that Ed would simply outgrow his issues and eventually be fine. However, as it became all too clear in retrospect, Ed was not fine, and his problems culminated in the worst possible way when he killed his grandparents. The narrator emphasizes the importance of examining Edie's relationship with his mother and its impact on his life. While having a bad parent in no way excuses his actions, the hatred and resentment Ed felt towards his mother fueled him for years, and he himself pointed to her as the driving force behind his rage. The narrator then plays a clip from one of Edie's interviews, in which he discusses his mother, revealing the depth of their troubled relationship and its role in his crimes. In the chilling audio clip, Ed Kemper discusses his mother's role in his crimes, revealing the depth of their dysfunctional relationship. He describes her as knowing all his buttons and making him dance like a puppet in pain. Their fights even turned physical, with Ed once grabbing his mother and throwing her onto her bed, threatening to kill her. Kemper then recounts an incident that occurred just 1 week before he murdered his mother. He picked up 2 young women in Berkeley who were hitchhiking, describing them as petite dolls in granny dresses. He saw this as a test of his self-control, wondering if he could resist the temptation to harm them. The women wanted to go one way, but Kemper knew they needed to go in the opposite direction. If they had gone the way they insisted, it would have taken them back to where Kemper had murdered his first 2 victims. In that moment, Kemper realized that all he had to do was relax, and the women would essentially be taking themselves to their own deaths. He had the same gun he had used in his previous crimes with him in the car. However, Kemper resisted the urge and as gently as he could, took the women where they needed to go. This incident was a turning point for Kemper. He decided that either his mother had to die, or more innocent women like the ones he had just encountered would lose their lives. It was at this moment that he resolved to murder his mother. The narrator is deeply unsettled by the nonchalant manner in which Kemper discusses these events, as if he were talking about something as mundane as purchasing expensive cheese at a grocery store. The narrator also points out that Kemper seems to fit the archetypal image of a serial killer with a history of parental abuse, animal cruelty, and violent fantasies. The reason Kemper fits so neatly into this mold is that he was one of the first individuals used as a poster child for what a serial killer could be. Former FBI agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler, pioneers of criminal profiling at Quantico's Behavioral Science Unit, conducted extensive interviews with Kemper. The insights gained from these interviews heavily influenced society's understanding of modern-day serial killers. Kemper's impact can still be felt today, 47 years after his capture and conviction. His grim legacy and the horror he caused continue to be referenced in popular culture, from inspiring the character of Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, to having clips of his interviews featured in songs by bands like System of a Down. He was also recently portrayed as a character in Netflix hit show Mindhunter, which is based on the book mentioned earlier. In reality, Kemper has waived several parole hearings over the last few decades, seemingly recognizing that he is not safe to be out in the world. He is known as a model prisoner, and while fascination with his terrible crimes persists, Kemper remains behind bars where he belongs, likely for the rest of his life.